Donald Trump seems to set the cat amongst the pigeons, goes to the United Nations, where he is clearly a hostile guest. You know, they don't like him there very much, so much so that they made the escalator fail and then somehow managed to conspire to have his teleprompter not work. But he's basically come back from Europe going, your countries are going to hell. So that was that honeymoon over and done with then, right?
Well, I think he's not the world's #1 diplomat, and I think that the teleprompter probably meant he had an even longer speech than he had in mind before. Listen, I must confess, I was a bit bemused by the surprise that was shown by quite a lot of commentators about his speech yesterday, particularly in relation to Ukraine, because he changes his mind every 5 minutes. So, he seems to be on side for Ukraine today, but who knows where he'll be in a couple of months' time. And what was striking about his comments in that regard, of course, was he didn't say where the money was going to come from. And he's made it very clear that he expects Europe to look after issues in its own backyard. And, I have some sympathy with that view. I mean, Europe has been freeloading off the US for decades now. And of course, in the past, they complained. I think probably Joe Biden and his Secretary of State would have complained, Obama, George W. Bush before that. But what's different now, of course, is that there's no pretense to diplomacy from Donald Trump. This is his style. It's shock and awe.
Right.
And of course, to an extent, it's worked. Let's be honest, in the last 6 months, Europe has woken up. Countries like Germany and Spain, who are spending less than 1.5% of GDP on defence, are now committed to a rapid path towards spending 4 or 5%. And here in the UK, we've tended to provide a bit more, but again, our defence spending has gone down. My concern really about what's happening in the UK is, we may spend a lot of money, but a lot of it's been wasted. Defence procurement has been a disgrace in the last 20 or 30 years. So let's make sure that we are going to spend more money, whether that's providing that for Ukraine or for our own defences, that we spend it wisely.
Well, indeed. And I mean, one of the things I suppose that is refreshing about Donald Trump's approach is that, compared to what has gone before, he is having more success because, as you said, Europe had kind of, faltered, fallen way behind in terms of GDP spending on defence. And what he's managed to get them to do is to kind of buy American arms to then give to Ukraine. So he's sort of achieved two things, really. One, he's getting money in for the US economy that otherwise he would have been giving away for nothing if he was Joe Biden. And then Europe is actually spending more on their defence effectively to give arms to Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. The one thing I slightly disagree with what Trump had to say. I don't think Russia's economy is struggling as much as you think. I mean, on paper, you look at it and think it's so dependent upon oil and gas. The population is actually going down because of reduced birth rates and life expectancy going down in Russia as a whole. But of course, it's got a very captive market for its oil and gas. Russia goes to China, goes to India, goes elsewhere. So I don't think Russia's struggling. And in many ways, I think this was a salvo pushing, obviously Putin will be listening to this, and the idea is to try and get Putin around the negotiating table again. And the reality really for Ukraine is we don't want an ongoing war. I mean, we do need to have a ceasefire, and I appreciate that then the debate becomes, where are the boundaries all set. But I think an ongoing war isn't good news for Ukraine or indeed for Russia.
No. And what do you make of his sort of remarks around about shooting down Russian jets? I mean, he basically said Russian aircraft intruding into NATO airspace should be shot down. And we've seen a couple of incursions recently, haven't we, from the Russian side, who have kind of intimated that it was a bit of a test.
Well, it is. And I think Estonia and particularly Poland feel that they were seconds away from doing something dramatic. But I think the reality, of course, is if something were to be shot down, very quickly we go from a Cold War situation to a much potentially hotter war. However, I also think, you can't just have a situation where Putin is constantly pushing a stick at NATO countries. I mean, he is trying to make it very clear to NATO countries that they are in their backyard going to make life difficult for them. This will have to come to a head in some form or other. I hope it won't necessarily come down to shooting down a Russian plane, but it is understandable that if constantly there are breaches of airspace, then probably there is going to be some consequence.
And funnily enough, speaking about sort of Russian wealth and Russian, sanctions and whether they work or not, someone was telling me who knows about these things that Istanbul is currently the biggest place and the most expensive market for new Ferraris. And apparently the reason for that is an awful lot of young Russians who are wealthy have moved to Istanbul and are buying a load of Ferraris. So I don't know where they're getting their money from, but it's coming from somewhere.
Well, it is, and it isn't just Istanbul. I mean, obviously, everyone looks at what's happening in Dubai and the rest of the United Arab Emirates. And what tends to happen is that international flows of relatively hot money move from location to location. So, for example, a decade or so ago, it was Cyprus and then Malta, and as you say, probably it is now Turkey and the UAE.
Yes. And what about his general view as well of the West and its countries going to hell? I mean, as I say, he was only at Chequers a little while ago. He seemed to be very enamoured with the history of Britain and the history of all the various people that had been to Chequers, and he was obviously one of them, and he was very happy about that. But when he said this, I mean, I'm going to ask you in a minute what you make of it. Have a listen.
When your prisons are filled with so-called asylum seekers who repaid kindness, and that's what they did. They repaid kindness with crime. It's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. See, I can tell you, I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell. Any system that results in the mass trafficking of children is inherently evil. Yet that is exactly what the globalist migration agenda has done, and it's what it's all about.
Yeah. A lot of people listening to that yesterday saying to me, well, he's not wrong, is he?
No, I mean, listen, he's put it in pretty undiplomatic and robust terms that we're all getting used to listening to. But as you say, underneath it all, there's a kernel of truth. And the trouble is, as we've seen here in the UK, we are powerless. We thought we were taking back control when we voted to leave the European Union almost a decade ago. And of course, the reality is it has changed our relationship with the EU and free movement of people. But of course, the large-scale migration and the Human Rights Act and being a member of the ECHR is something that still needs to be resolved. And to be honest, it's not just a debate here in the UK, of course. It's a debate throughout the Western world. Trump is making a valid point. Now, organizations such as the United Nations obviously so dependent upon American money, and of course, the fact that he has cut almost to the bone any money going into their international development, USAID, will also make an impact on the way in which the UN can behave. And I think that's ultimately the shot across the bows that he was putting across out in New York yesterday. But no, he's onto something, and the reality is, we see it here in the UK, and the way that the whole debate on immigration has changed beyond recognition. Last week we saw Nigel Farage coming out with saying we've got to end indefinite leave to remain, and the first instinct of conservatives was to say, well, no, it's all a bit too difficult. You can't do it that easily. There were implications from some on the left of that's racism, but I suspect in 6 months' time, Keir Starmer's government, assuming he's still in post, but whoever's in the Prime Minister at the time will probably be making changes along those lines. We are in a rapid state of flux about this whole immigration issue.
Well, that's it. There's no question that the British Labour Party policy has changed irrevocably since just about 3 years ago, where they would never have wanted to put any barriers up to people coming across the Channel, other than trying to make it even easier for them to come. Now they're actually actively trying to deport people because they realise that's what British people want to see. And similarly, in the rest of Europe, there's no question that for the last 25 years, Europe in pretty much every capital and every city in the West has changed dramatically.
It has. I'm obviously based in central London. My constituency was in central London, so we've been used to the hypermobility and hyperdiversity, but you can see the demographic changes that have taken place in my 35 years of adult life since I first moved to London. But that's happening in much of the rest of the country now. And, there are small market towns in the middle of Lincolnshire and Wiltshire where exactly the same is happening. But I think what's also interesting, and you touched on it earlier on, actually, Mike, in relation to the story that the BBC investigative journalists put forward. This is something that's fairly unknown for the BBC to be digging down deeply into what's going on in these asylum hostels with all of the taxi fares and everything else. And again, I think that reflects the sense that there's now such a deep sense of unease here in the country. And of course, a lot of that unease comes, and I remember when I was a constituency MP, it came often from immigrant populations, because they're the people who feel most vulnerable very quickly when everything gets more hostile here, because they feel they've played fair over the years. They may well have lived here for 2 or 3 generations, and now feel that a sense of a large influx of people coming in illegally and playing the system is actually undermining their position above all.
And exactly what it does. Good to talk to you, Mark. Thanks very much indeed. Mark Field, former foreign